Recognizing Minister of Energy Mines.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. I move now that Bill 15 be read a second time.
Please proceed.
Okay. Honourable Speaker, I'm pleased to present the Energy Mines and Petroleum Resources Statutes Amendment Act 2018. Bill 15, which is this very bill, amends provisions in the Oil and Gas Activities Act and the Petroleum and Natural Gas Act. So first I'll say a few words about what we're doing to amend the Oil and Gas Activities Act. So what people in the House may or may not know is that the downturn in the oil and gas sector over the last few years has resulted in several challenges for many companies. They are seeing higher debt loads, the more difficulty to meet their overall expenditures, and as a result they're having to declare bankruptcy, which has obviously led to an increase in insolvencies in that particular sector. How that impacts us, Honourable Speaker, is something that we're trying to deal with here today in Bill 15. And so specifically, the BC Oil and Gas Commission has seen a significant rise in the number of orphaned wells since 2016. And so maybe I'll just take a moment to explain what orphaned wells are.
Honourable members, please proceed.
Thank you. So this might be a new term for other members in the House as well as for people in the public who are not as familiar with how things occur on a day-to-day basis in the oil and gas sector. And so as we drill for natural gas that heats most of our homes in this province, those wells would be termed orphaned when a company, the parent company of that well, becomes insolvent and no longer exists, and so hence the term orphan well. So very, very Oliver Twist kind of language, Honourable Speaker, but that's the best way I can find to describe it so that people understand exactly what we're dealing with here is that a well is no longer active, but it still exists, and the people or the company who was responsible for dealing with it no longer exists, however. And so therefore, we as a government have a responsibility to deal with that well. Historically, how we have dealt with these orphaned wells is through a funding model called the Orphan Site Reclamation Fund. And this is a fund that companies pay into through a tax that is defined in the Oil and Gas Activities Act. And this tax is levied on to companies. Money goes into that fund, and we use that fund to reclaim these orphan sites. But because there's been an increase due to this downturn in the sector of orphan sites, we are finding that that fund is not able to keep pace with the cost of reclamation of the increase in orphan funds. And so that's why we are here today, essentially, is so that we can make sure that we have a sustainable way of dealing with orphan wells going into the future, not only in terms of reclaiming them, but how do we prevent them. So to do that, the proposed amendments that we have here for the Oil and Gas Activities Act do two main things. One is improve that funding model for the Orphan Site Reclamation Fund, and the second one is to introduce tools to reduce the number of future orphan sites and the liability associated with them. And so I'll be talking about, in that second part, Honourable Speaker, inactive sites or dormant sites. But first I'd like to talk about how we're going to improve the funding model for the Orphan Site Reclamation Fund. So these amendments will improve the funding model by replacing that tax that I mentioned just a few minutes ago with a levy. These are very legalistic terms. People might wonder, what's the difference? It's money going into a government fund. Isn't that all just taxation? But not quite, Honourable Speaker. Taxation is something that is defined within legislation. It has a particular formula. It can only be changed by legislation, and it's not necessarily, in this particular situation, responsive to this sudden downturn and then this sudden increase of orphan wells. So we're proposing a levy be imposed by regulation of the commission board, so that's the board of the Oil and Gas Commission, with of course government oversight. The rate of the proposed levy can be more easily adjusted as a result, if we do this through regulation, than the existing tax. And it provides more flexible avenue to secure funds when and as they are required. So proposed amendments will also provide flexibility to add funds from other sources if that's required, such as other money paid to the Commission by industry for the purposes of restoration. Honourable Speaker, I think it's, at this moment, I just want to say that I think it's really important too for government to ensure that we're finding a strong balance between industry paying for its own activities and the need to reclaim those activities once they've concluded, but also the public interest being met here. And we feel that the levy is one of the ways that we're going to be achieving that very important balance, and being able to do that through regulation over time to make sure that we're continuously able to respond to the circumstances of the day. This particular mechanism allows us to do that. So the second thing that these proposed amendments are meant to do will be to introduce powers for the Oil and Gas Commission and the OGC for those who enjoy acronyms, to make regulations requiring the restoration of dormant or inactive oil and gas sites. And I'm going to use the term dormant going forward, Honourable Speaker, but for those who are in the industry who might be more familiar, inactive sites, we're using those two terms interchangeably. And what a dormant site is it's a site whose parent company still exists. They are not insolvent, but the site has not been active. It is dormant for all intents and purposes, Honourable Speaker, so it's not producing anything, and it actually needs to be reclaimed. So restoration work on dormant sites will reduce the liability associated with these sites. So the sooner we can restore them, the sooner that we can reclaim them, the sooner that we're reducing liability for the public interest as well as for industry. We'd also be limiting the chance that restoration will need to be funded by the Orphaned Site Reclamation Fund, which I already spoke about, Honourable Speaker, and the need to make sure that that fund is sustainable. But ultimately, we'd like to see restoration done before we even have to access that site. And that's that preventative component to this legislation that I was talking about, and how we deal with our overall orphan well situation in BC. So this proposed framework will provide flexibility, obviously, for the Oil and Gas Commission to ensure that site cleanup requirements are manageable for permit holders and meeting the test of the public interest. Amendments also introduce other tools to reduce the number of future orphan sites and the liability associated with them. The amendments that will allow the these amendments will allow the Oil and Gas Commission to review permit applications and cancel or suspend permits if parties associated with the permit or applicant have a history of non-compliance. So that's an important piece, Honourable Speaker. If we know somebody has a history, a continuous history, time and time again, of not cleaning up after themselves and leaving all of industry on the hook for their orphan site, maybe they shouldn't be doing business in British Columbia. And so we want to make sure that we are preventing that from happening, and that those who are responsible operators are the ones who are indeed providing all of us, 50% of us, with the natural gas that heats our homes. It will also allow the Commission to reinstate and transfer permits to a new owner to facilitate continued activity or completion of restoration work. So again, a company becomes insolvent, but there's another company who's interested in taking over that well. This will allow the Oil and Gas Commission to do just that, and also provide them with the responsibility of restoring that particular site. Amendments are also proposed to enhance the powers of the Commission to respond to emergencies and manage heritage resources. And so, for example, an emergency takes place. Right now, the Oil and Gas Commission is not able to directly move into that emergency site and block off roads and do whatever is necessary to maintain public safety. So we want to make sure that we're giving them that power to do that. After all, Honourable Speaker, the most important thing at the end of the day in all of this is ensuring that the public is safe in an emergency situation, and we want to make sure that government is providing our Crown agencies with all the tools possible to do that. We also want to make sure that we are maintaining our heritage sites in British Columbia, and the Oil and Gas Commission has a role, but not yet within legislation, and so we want to make that very formal. Finally, Honourable Speaker, on the Oil and Gas Activities Act, the amendments will allow Oil and Gas Commission operations, the OGC, to have greater tools around debt collection as well. So I mentioned that Bill 15 also amends the Petroleum and Natural Gas Act. So I'll speak to those amendments. And what they will do essentially is ensure provisions enacted in 2014 regarding tenure extensions and rental relief can be implemented. So these will provide relief to tenure holders who are prevented from accessing their tenure due to circumstances beyond their control. So for example, a tenure holder will be looking to start some exploration work or some drilling work on their tenure. But a large-scale construction project might be taking place. There might be negotiations with First Nations or local government that are causing delays, and so we want to make sure that they are not left on the hook for the costs associated with those delays if they have if it's no fault of their own. And so what we want to do is make sure that the tenure holders don't lose their tenure, for example, Honourable Speaker, so that their opportunities still exist into the future when they become available. The proposed amendments will also replace the requirement to advertise tenure dispositions in the BC Gazette. I know everybody here reads daily all advertisements that occur in the BC Gazette. Maybe just one or two left who do, Honourable Speaker. But almost everybody in British Columbia now goes to the internet, goes online to government websites for their information. And so while government and the OGC has long been putting this type of information on websites, the official means has still been the BC Gazette. We are now moving that over in 2018 to be the internet. So government is keeping up, Honourable Speaker, just barely, with how everybody else is doing business. Honourable Speaker, that concludes my remarks. I look forward to hearing the debate on this bill. I will say, though, I'm very proud that we're putting forward this bill because we do have a situation where we need to find the appropriate balance between the public interest and industry so that we continue to see economic development in the Northeast around our natural gas sector, and not just because it's a good economic sector that provides good family supporting jobs, but to this day, natural gas is what's heating 50% of British Columbian homes, and I certainly don't want to be the person responsible for turning the heat off in the middle of winter. So we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to maintain that industry and make sure that the public interest is met. And so with that, Honourable Speaker, I will take my seat and listen to the rest of the debate.
Thank you very much, Minister. Recognizing Peace River South.
Well, thank you, Honourable Speaker, and appreciate, first of all, the Minister bringing this bill forward. When she says she's looking forward to the debate, I think it'll be more of just some commentary rather than debate. This is actually an important bill anytime we're modernizing an act that we have. When you look at the Orphaned Site Reclamation Fund itself, I mean, that was introduced by the past government in 2006 for a lot of the same issues that the Minister just addressed today. We want to make sure that when we have companies operating in British Columbia, that the due diligence has taken place. We want to ensure the safeguards are in place as well to protect not only the province, but I would argue more importantly to protect the landowners and the people affected with this industry. When you look around the drilling activity that we have right now, as the minister highlighted, it is pretty well exclusively in the Peace region, in my part of the province. So I agree with the premise of the bill, not only as the critic for this issue, but also as the local MLA for the area. I do obviously we'll have some questions, I'll have some questions for the minister when we get to committee stage on this bill, just to try to address some of the, maybe I'd say concerns of some of the areas. One of them that we'll be asking about that really raises a concern for me is when we start taking more out of the Act and putting it into policy or regulation that gives the opportunity for Cabinet and the minister to actually work directly to change regulation behind the scenes rather than in a public and open, debatable format like we have here in the House that obviously also has the scrutiny that can come forward from not only the opposition but the public prior to a regulation being put into place. I think I will also acknowledge I guess the commentary the minister had that welcomed the OGC to the wide world web, moving away from the Gazette and doing more on the internet. Obviously that is important. I know we say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. There's a lot of information the OGC has already out there. I work very closely with them, as do citizens in my riding, on this specific issue. When we look at the fact that we want to continue promoting this operation in British Columbia, we want to look at continued drilling activity, continued pipeline activity to make sure that we have, as the minister said, the resource. So when we want to heat our water, we have those, we have the gas there. When we want to heat our homes, specifically for 6 months a year, it's been this winter up in my part of the world. You know, this resource is important. It's part of our economy, it's part of society, and we need to ensure that we do everything we can to promote, not hinder, the activity. But this bill, I think, is also, it's important parts of this as well, because every company that I talk with, every company that's doing business in British Columbia wants to do what's appropriate as well, looking out for the environment, looking out for the people in the area, the landowners that have to deal with this activity on their land. But more importantly, we want to ensure, in a perfect world, I guess, that we would never actually need to have the Orphaned Site Reclamation Fund. Although we're going to be putting money in there, companies should be doing their due diligence. Companies should be doing the proper reclamation of sites, and they know that. And you know, this fund is appropriate in case there are circumstances where that doesn't take place. But in the forefront, the purpose should be for companies to do that work at all times. Government expects it. I would say the companies themselves expect it, but more importantly, again, the public and the citizens expect that, that when the work is finished, that proper reclamation takes place. And again, when that happens, we actually would look at the situation, the proper reclamation, where the landowners, the farmers, specifically in the area, can then utilize that land going forward once reclamation is finished. So I know there probably won't be a lot of discussion specifically to this bill. It's something we are going to support and have questions, though, as I said, for the minister during committee stage. And again, just want to thank the minister for bringing this forward.
Thank you, member. Member for Cowichan Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources Statutes Amendment Act 2018 improves the management and restoration of orphan wells in BC, not to be confused with Orson Welles, who sounds a lot like this, but orphan wells in BC, in order to better protect our province's environment. Orphan wells are sites that have been identified by the Oil and Gas Commission as sites of energy mining and petroleum activity wherein the company responsible for the activity is insolvent or unresponsive to contact by the Commission. Similarly, dormant sites are sites of activity that are no longer in use. In both these cases, the unused sites can create pollution leaks into the surrounding natural environment, and this pollution in turn impacts the habitants and communities nearby. To ensure that companies can create orphan or dormant sites, to ensure that companies that create orphan or dormant sites are held accountable for their activities, this Act provides better enforcement mechanisms to the Commission. These enforcement mechanisms include replacing our current tax-based funding structure of BC's Orphan Site Reclamation Fund with a structure based on funding gleaned from levies against non-compliant companies. And to make sure that these companies pay these levies, the Commissioner may issue and file with a court a certificate to enforce payment. In this way, there will be increased accountability towards management of orphan and dormant sites, and in turn, increased accountability towards our environment. This Act also makes other notable changes. It gives the Commission authority to limit permit requests if parties associated with the party applying for a permit have a history of non-compliance. It provides the Commission authority to protect public safety in the event of an emergency, and it increases the capacity of the Commission to manage heritage resources. All of these are important steps of environmental and community stewardship. It is essential that we take steps to ensure that companies are as concerned about protecting our natural environment as we are, and this Act does take steps towards that. The reason the Act has been created, as has been stated by the Minister, is to address the downturn in oil and gas prices, which has intensified the Oil and Gas Commission's need for enforcement tools for orphan and dormant site management. We would like to maintain that regardless of the state of the economy, environmental management is paramount to the health and safety of our province. I have a number of concerns, both broad and specific, I'd like to canvass as well, starting with some specifics from Bill 15. In section 43.1 on dormant wells, it is not entirely clear how the new category of dormant wells will relate to the existing category of inactive wells. Dormant wells to be defined by regulation, but how will proponents' obligations and rights with respect to dormant wells differ from those with respect to inactive wells? And what must a proponent do to resume activity at a dormant well? What security, for example, must a proponent post with respect to a dormant well to resume activity? In section 43.4, the liability reduction plan, there's no obvious reason why proponents should be able to negotiate reduced shutdown obligations with respect to any wells, because this doesn't seem to promote restoration, and it's not clear how reduced shutdown obligations might relate to the proponent's liability. In section 47, the Orphan Site Restoration Levy does not seem to change or enhance the requirements for well restoration. And so we would like to see better standards or objectives for that restoration. Section 47.2 doesn't specify how the overall amount to be raised by the levy will be determined, and whether this is at the discretion of the Oil and Gas Commission Board. The Act doesn't provide guidance or mandatory considerations, no minimum annual levy, and without some kind of transparent audit or current conditions, practices, and standards, it'd be very difficult to know whether this amount would be adequate. We do see that this determination of the levy isn't left to proponents, so that's on the bright side, but there does seem to be some degree of informal negotiation that would be likely. The amendment doesn't mandate how the Commission will estimate the cost of compliance for every permit held by every permit holder. So there's no guidance or mandatory considerations, no minimum cost tied to industry average restoration costs. However, again, we're seeing it's not left entirely to proponents. So I look forward to working through these questions and other specific concerns at the committee stage. A few of the general omissions and broader concerns is no requirement for proponents to develop, fund, or implement comprehensive and detailed restoration plans across their portfolios. So if you have a permit holder with multiple permits, the portfolio comprehensive restoration plan isn't there, so we'd like to look at that in committee as well. and no immediate or adequate penalty for failure to restore a site, for example, automatically suspending other permits held by a proponent that fails to adequately restore one site and they have a permit elsewhere. Are you just standing? Okay. The new measures would prohibit affiliated individuals from obtaining new permits. And finally, no required role for First Nations in defining restoration standards, establishing orphan site restoration levy, or conducting restoration. We do have some broader concerns with the Oil and Gas Commission generally. There is an inherent conflict happening when a regulatory agency is tasked with not only monitoring and enforcing compliance in a sector's development, but also promoting and supporting its economic growth. Yet this is the case with the Oil and Gas Commission. It has led to some staggering issues in our province. Under the Oil and Gas Commission's watch, for example, several dozen illegal dams have been built by oil and gas operations. These unauthorized dams violate several provincial regulations, including companies applying for water licenses after the dams have already been built, failing to submit engineering plans for structures that store huge amounts of water, and failing to ensure proper safety measures are in place or seismic evaluations completed, and failing to adequately consult First Nations. I have seen reports linking fracking to groundwater contamination and numerous reports of old wells continuing to leak methane. This is a pattern of a regulatory body failing to enforce regulations that are vital to the health and well-being of BC's citizens and environment, as well as the public's trust in this entire sector. Just as the National Energy Board has suffered when it comes to perceptions of transparency, accountability, confidence, safety, and security, so too has the Oil and Gas Commission. A panel of experts appointed by the federal government to review the National Energy Board recommended a series of reforms, including separating its mandate into two distinct agencies. I think the same should be done with BC's Oil and Gas Commission. As this government brings in reforms to environmental assessment and professional reliance, they should also be looking to reform the Oil and Gas Commission so that this body is not simultaneously promoting and regulating the activities of industry in our province. This bill, which provides for mechanisms to deal with one problem, should be seen as only a first step towards greater reforms of the regulation of this industry, reforms that will ensure that the citizens of BC benefit from the resources that we all collectively own and do not incur the costs that should rightly fall to industry. And just on a note on the use of gas in BC, and I noted the minister said, that the gas goes to heat most of our homes in the province. In 2016, we saw 56.3% of BC's gas go to Alberta, used primarily for oil sands activities there. 10.7% of the gas remained in BC, and 33% of our natural gas exports went to the US. And so it's very important to recognize that a lot of our gas is actually going to our province, the province to the east of us, and being used for tar sands activity there. And also important to note that between 2007 and 2016, gas production in this province increased by 72%. And we saw a significant decrease over that time in revenues to the provincial government. I look forward to discussing this bill more in committee. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Carrier Butcher-Coton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to take my place on the debate for Bill 15, Energy Mines and Petroleum Resources Statutes Amendment Act 2018. If passed, this bill will replace the existing tax structure with a levy to be paid into BC's Orphan Site Reclamation Fund. This is a result of incredible work done by past governments to ensure that these regimes are predictable and followed. It is important we continue this work here in British Columbia. It is important we work to ensure our environmental regulations are some of the strongest in the world. I am very proud of the fact that here in British Columbia we have some of the strictest environmental regulations. The Orphan Site Reclamation Fund is an example of that work. Established in 2006, this has been an industry-funded initiative that ensures taxpayers are no liable for the associated costs of reclamation. The fund is used to decommission wells, restore land, including public, private, and government lands. This has helped build social license to ensure that we have a plan in place should the owner of a well become insolvent or they are unable to be found by the Oil and Gas Commission. This partnership is important because it provides that certainty which creates and protects jobs. Because as global citizens, we all have a great responsibility to ensure that British Columbia is left better than we found it. We owe this to our children, grandchildren, and the generations that follow. It is a responsibility that I know we all take very serious in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, these types of partnerships are important, and it is incumbent on us to ensure they continue into the future. Governments of any stripe must operate in good faith, place regulations in place that give the public confidence, while ensuring they protect our beautiful province. Proponents must also operate in good faith, follow these regulations and good relations that are required to operate in British Columbia. I am proud to have stood in this House and voted many of times for legislation that is some of the strictest in the world, but also ensures that companies have the certainty they need to create jobs and invest. One bill that springs to mind is the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, which introduced the provincial benchmark of 0.16 tons of carbon dioxide for each ton of LNG produced, which ensured that BC will have the cleanest LNG industry in the world. This is an example of us looking forward to ensure that we are leaders here in British Columbia. We do not want to be amongst the cleanest. We have an objective to be the cleanest. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. I'll make a couple of closing remarks before I move our going to committee. And I just want to, I wish that this was the time when school kids were up in the gallery watching how all sides of the House are talking about how important this piece of legislation is and how much agreement we have just communicated and our overall enthusiasm to get to committee stage, all of us, and get right into the nitty-gritty of this bill so we can make sure that we're dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's and making sure that the devil is not living in the details of this bill. So I very much look forward to doing that with members. And at this time then, Honourable Speaker, I'll move second reading of Bill 15. Honourable Speaker, this is the first time I've ever had to move a second reading, so I'm not too sure if I'm getting the rules right. Okay, I move second reading of Bill 15.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion. Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I move that the bill be referred to a committee of the whole House to be considered at the next sitting of the House after today.
Government House Leader. Oh, you've heard the question. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carried.